An old man walks slowly through the temple courts of Jerusalem on a morning that looks like every other morning. His name is Simeon. His hands shake a little now when he carries anything heavier than a scroll. He has walked these same stones for so many years that he no longer notices the smell of incense, or the sound of doves in wicker cages waiting to be sold, or the murmur of pilgrims arguing about the price of a sacrifice. He has been waiting for so long that waiting itself has become his life's work. Decades earlier, something happened to Simeon that he has never fully explained to anyone. The Spirit of God told him a single staggering thing: he would not die. Not yet, not until his own eyes had seen the Messiah of Israel. You can imagine what that promise did to a man's life. Very birth in Jerusalem became a question. Every young couple walking into the temple courts became a possibility. Every single morning for years, Simeon woke up and wondered if today was the day God would finally keep his word. Here is what you need to understand before we go any further. Simeon was not waiting in a vacuum. He was waiting at the tail end of something almost no one talks about: 400 years of silence. 4 centuries in which no prophet stood up in Israel and said, "Thus saith the Lord." 400 years in which the heavens, as far as anyone could tell, had simply closed. There's a Hebrew word for this kind of silence: chasha. It means more than just the absence of sound. It carries the sense of holding your peace on purpose, restraining yourself from speaking even when you could. Not a God who has nothing to say. A God who, for reasons of his own, is choosing not to say it yet. You will want to remember that distinction, because it changes everything about how you understand what comes next. Stay with me, because this is where most people get the story wrong. They picture those 400 years as empty, a blank page between Malachi and Matthew, a pause button pressed on the story of God and his people, like the universe itself went on hold while everyone waited for something to happen. That is the version you have probably heard in a sermon or read in a study Bible footnote, in a single sentence that rushes past the most loaded silence in human history. This is not a story about a gap in the Bible. This is not a story about missing pages. This is not a story about God forgetting his people in some cosmic administrative error. This is a story about the most carefully engineered silence in recorded history, and by the end of it, you are going to understand exactly why God waited 400 years to send his Son, and why every single one of those years mattered. Because here is the secret nobody tells you in Sunday school. While heaven was silent, the world was being rearranged. Empires rose and fell. Languages spread across continents. Roads were carved through mountains. A temple was destroyed and rebuilt. Israel was crushed, freed, crushed again, and freed again. And, somewhere in the middle of all that noise, an old man named Simeon kept waking up every morning, holding on to a promise that made no sense, in a silence that felt like it would never break. You will meet him again. We will get back to Simeon, but not yet. Because to understand why his wait finally ended the way it did, you have to go back to the very last words anyone in Israel heard from God's own mouth. You have to go back to a prophet named Malachi, standing in the ruins of everyone's hope, saying something nobody wanted to hear. Picture Jerusalem around 430 years before Jesus is born. The temple has been rebuilt, but it is nothing like the temple Solomon built. Older men who remember the first temple weep when they see this smaller, plainer version standing in its place. The walls of the city have been repaired, but the glory everyone hoped would return with the rebuilding has not returned. The people are back in the land. The sacrifices are happening again. And yet something is broken that stone and mortar cannot fix. Into this exhaustion steps a prophet named Malachi. His name means "my messenger," and he delivers a message nobody wants. He tells the priests they have grown lazy, offering blind and sick animals to God instead of their best, treating worship like a chore instead of an honor. He tells the people they have stopped tithing, stopped caring for the poor, stopped believing their obedience matters. He tells husbands they are breaking covenant with the wives of their youth. It is not a comforting sermon. It is closer to a difficult conversation between God and a people who have stopped showing up for the relationship. And then Malachi says something strange. He says, before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes, God will send the prophet Elijah to turn the hearts of fathers to their children. And then he stops talking. That is it. That is the last verse. The final words of the Old Testament, in the order most English Bibles place it, end with the word curse. Not a blessing, not a triumphant finale. A warning, trailing off into silence. You have to sit with how devastating that must have felt. Imagine being a Jewish parent in Jerusalem watching your children grow up after Malachi's voice goes quiet. You raised them on stories of a God who spoke directly to Moses, who thundered from a mountain, who sent prophet after prophet for centuries to warn, comfort, and guide his people. And now, nothing. No new word, no fresh promise. Just an old scroll and a closing line about curses, read again and again in synagogues that themselves did not even exist yet in Malachi's day. But the silence did not begin with Malachi's last sentence. It began decades earlier, in a trauma the people of Israel had never fully recovered from. In 586 years before Christ, the Babylonians had stormed Jerusalem, burned Solomon's temple to the ground, and dragged the survivors into exile hundreds of miles from home. An entire generation grew up in Babylon, not in the Promised Land. And something happened there that nobody planned and nobody could undo. They lost their language, not all at once, not on purpose, but slowly. The Hebrew their grandparents spoke at the dinner table started competing with Aramaic, the trade language of the empire around them. Children who grew up in Babylon spoke Aramaic in the marketplace, Aramaic with their friends, Aramaic in their dreams. By the time King Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon and allowed the Jews to return home, an entire generation could understand the Hebrew scriptures only with difficulty. Ezra the scribe would later have to stand in front of crowds and have the Hebrew text translated into Aramaic, sentence by sentence, just so the people could understand their own holy book. Here's what most people miss. That loss felt like a wound. It felt like one more thing taken from a broken people. But it was also, quietly, the first thread in something nobody could see yet. A people who had once spoken only Hebrew were now used to translation, used to hearing God's word filtered through another tongue. That adjustment, born out of grief and conquest, would matter more than anyone in Jerusalem could have imagined. And it gets stranger. Roughly a century after Malachi falls silent, a young Macedonian king named Alexander sweeps out of Greece with an army that nothing in the ancient world can stop. By 332 years before Christ, he has conquered Egypt, Persia, and the entire region surrounding Judea, including Jerusalem itself. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing centuries later in his work Antiquities of the Jews, even records a tradition that Alexander himself visited Jerusalem and showed unusual respect to the Jewish high priest, sparing the city from destruction. But the real impact of Alexander's conquest was not military, it was linguistic. Everywhere Alexander's armies marched, they carried a common trade language with them, a simplified, practical form of Greek that historians call koine, meaning common. Within a generation, Koine Greek became the language of commerce, government, and education across the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Jewish communities scattered across Alexander's former empire began speaking Greek as their primary language. Eventually, Jewish scholars in Egypt would translate the entire Hebrew Bible into Greek, a translation called the Septuagint, so that Greek-speaking Jews could still read their own scriptures. You can imagine no one in Jerusalem celebrating this at the time. A foreign king's army marching through Judea was not good news. A foreign language replacing Hebrew in everyday conversation was not something the faithful prayed for. It felt again like loss layered on top of loss. But hold that thought, because 400 years later, when the apostles finally carry the news of Jesus out of Jerusalem and into the wider world, they will not need translators in city after city. They will preach in Koine Greek, the same common language Alexander's conquest spread across the entire known world, and people from Rome to Ephesus to Corinth will understand every word without an interpreter. The very language of grief became the language of good news. This is not a story about a number. This is not a story about a verse. This is not a story about a doctrine. This is a story about every painful, confusing, seemingly random event in those silent centuries quietly becoming a brick in a foundation nobody could see being built. Let's pause for 1 second, because I want you to notice the pattern that is already forming. A scribe's loss of language became a bridge for translation. A conqueror's army became a delivery system for a common tongue. Every event that looked, in the moment, like one more disaster for the people of God, turned out to be a piece of infrastructure for something nobody alive at the time could have predicted. Keep that pattern in your mind, because it is going to repeat again and again as we go deeper into these silent centuries. And by the end of this video, you will never read the phrase, 400 years of silence, the same way again. If a video like this is new to you, this channel exists for exactly this kind of thing. Taking the parts of the Bible nobody explains clearly and walking through them slowly enough that they finally make sense. If that is valuable to you, consider subscribing, because we have more of these waiting. And if you are already seeing the pattern, drop a comment with the word watching, just so I know you are still with me, because what comes next is where the silence stops looking accidental and starts looking like a plan. Now watch what happens next, because the next chapter of this silence is not quiet at all. It is violent. By 167 years before Christ, the political situation in Judea has gone from uncomfortable to unbearable. After Alexander's death, his empire splintered among his generals, and Judea eventually fell under the control of a Greek dynasty called the Seleucids, ruled from Syria. And the king sitting on that throne is a man named Antiochus IV, a ruler so obsessed with his own glory that he gave himself the title Epiphanes, meaning God manifest. Antiochus did not just want to rule Judea. He wanted to erase what made the Jewish people distinct. He outlawed circumcision. He banned the Sabbath. He ordered copies of the Hebrew scriptures burned. And then he did something so calculated, so deliberately designed to break the Jewish soul, that you can still feel the shock of it reading about it today. He marched into the temple in Jerusalem, the same temple rebuilt after the exile, and he set up an altar to the Greek god Zeus inside the Holy of Holies. Then he sacrificed a pig on it. For a Jewish reader, there is almost no greater desecration imaginable. The pig was the symbol of everything unclean. The Holy of Holies was the one place on earth where God's presence was understood to dwell. Antiochus took the most forbidden animal and offered it in the most sacred place, and he did it on purpose to prove that the God of Israel could not stop him. You can imagine the despair that swept through Jerusalem. 400 years without a prophet's voice, and now this. No word from heaven, and a foreign king defiling the one place God's people believed heaven still touched earth. But this is where it gets remarkable. In a small village called Modian, an elderly priest named Mattathias refuses to comply with the order to sacrifice to a Greek god. When a Jewish man steps forward to offer the sacrifice in his place, Mattathias kills him on the spot, tears down the pagan altar, and flees into the hills with his 5 sons. One of those sons is a man named Judas, who will become known to history as Judas Maccabeus, Judas the Hammer. What follows is recorded in remarkable detail in the Jewish historical books 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and confirmed by Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews. Judas Maccabeus leads a guerrilla rebellion against one of the most powerful armies in the known world. Outnumbered, outgunned, fighting in the hills of Judea with whatever weapons his small band can gather, Judas wins battle after battle against Seleucid forces sent to crush him. By 164 years before Christ, Judas and his fighters retake Jerusalem and cleanse the temple, removing the pagan altar, purifying the Holy of Holies, and relighting the temple's sacred lampstand. Jewish families still celebrate that exact moment every year. It is called Hanukkah. Here's the part nobody tells you. The Maccabean revolt did something that mattered far beyond winning back a temple. For the first time in centuries, the Jewish people governed themselves again, under a new dynasty called the Hasmoneans, descended from Mattathias and his sons. It proved in living memory that Israel could fight for its identity and survive. It planted a fierce, burning hope that God had not abandoned his covenant people after all, even after 400 years without a single prophetic word. But political independence brought a different kind of crisis. Without a king from David's line, without a prophet to interpret God's will, the Jewish people split into factions, each one convinced they alone understood how to wait faithfully for whatever God would do next. There were the Pharisees, focused on strict obedience to the law and oral tradition, believing personal righteousness would hasten God's kingdom. There were the Sadducees, the priestly aristocracy, more comfortable working alongside Roman power than waiting for a disruptive Messiah who might cost them their privileged position. And out in the desert near the Dead Sea, a smaller, stricter group called the Essenes withdrew from society almost entirely, convinced that mainstream Judaism itself had become corrupt, choosing instead a life of ritual purity while they waited for God to act. Pay attention to this, because it matters more than it might seem. 3 different groups, reading the exact same Hebrew scriptures, waiting for the exact same promised Messiah, and arriving at 3 completely different ideas about what faithfulness during the silence should look like. Some of their writings, discovered nearly 2,000 years later in the caves at Qumran near the Dead Sea, give us a window into just how intensely these groups were searching the prophecies, calculating timelines, debating exactly when and how God's promised deliverer would finally appear. There's one more thing you need to know about that search, because it shows you just how specific the waiting had become. Centuries earlier, while the Jewish people were still in exile in Babylon, a prophet named Daniel had received a vision involving a countdown. 70 sets of 7 years, marked out from a decree to rebuild Jerusalem until the arrival of an anointed ruler. Scholars have debated the exact math for centuries, and you do not need to resolve that debate to feel the weight of what it meant. Jewish readers in the centuries before Jesus were not just hoping for a Messiah in some vague, someday sense. Some of them were doing math, counting years, watching the political horizon the way you might watch a clock when you know, roughly, when something important is supposed to happen. Imagine carrying that kind of expectation for generations. Not just a hope that God would act eventually, but a creeping sense that the clock itself was running out, that the math was getting closer, that something was coming and nobody knew exactly which year it would arrive. That tension, layered on top of Roman occupation, on top of the divide between Pharisee and Sadducee and Essene, on top of 4 centuries without a single prophetic voice to confirm any of it, is the exact atmosphere Jesus would eventually be born into. This is not a story about a number. This is not a story about a verse. This is not a story about a doctrine. This is a story about an entire nation so hungry for God to speak again that they built whole religious movements around the wait itself. And underneath all of it, a deeper anxiety was growing, one that none of these groups could fully answer. Because, by this point, a new power had begun pressing against Judea's borders from the west. A power that would not just rule Judea, but would reshape the entire known world into something almost perfectly designed for what was about to happen next. That power was Rome. By 63 years before Christ, the Roman general Pompey marches into Jerusalem and brings Judea under Roman control. Within a generation, Rome installs a new king over the Jewish people, a man who is not from David's line, not even fully Jewish by ancestry. His name is Herod, and history remembers him as Herod the Great, a title that says far more about his ambition than his character. Herod was, by almost every account, a brutal and paranoid ruler. Josephus records in painstaking detail how Herod executed members of his own family, including his wife and several of his sons, out of fear they were plotting against him. But Herod was also a builder on a scale almost nobody in the ancient world could match. He constructed fortresses, palaces, entire cities. And his most staggering project of all was the massive expansion and rebuilding of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, a structure so enormous and so beautifully built that even the Jewish people who despised Herod could not help marveling at it. Hold that thought, because here's what most people get wrong about Rome's rule over Judea. It was brutal. It was an occupation. And yet underneath that brutality, Rome was quietly assembling something the world had never had before: a genuine end-to-end transportation network. Roman engineers built roads connecting nearly every major city in the empire, paved and maintained well enough that a traveler could move from Jerusalem to Rome with reasonable speed and safety. Rome enforced a level of peace across its territories that historians later named the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period where piracy was suppressed, bandits were policed, and trade routes stayed open across 3 continents. Think about what that actually means. A network of roads stretching across the known world, a common trade language already spread by Alexander's conquests 3 centuries earlier, relative peace and safety for travelers, a unified currency and postal system, none of it built for the gospel. All of it, eventually, perfectly suited to carry the gospel farther and faster than anything in human history had ever traveled before. And there is one more thing Rome did, almost as an afterthought of imperial bureaucracy, that became the hinge point of the entire story. Caesar Augustus, ruling from Rome, orders a census of the entire empire, requiring every man to register in his ancestral hometown. It is, on the surface, nothing but tax administration. A bored emperor counting his subjects to count his revenue. But that single administrative order moves a pregnant young woman named Mary and her husband Joseph out of Nazareth and into Bethlehem, the very town the prophet Micah had named centuries earlier as the birthplace of Israel's promised ruler. A pagan emperor, thinking only of taxes, unknowingly fulfills a Hebrew prophecy he has never even heard of. This is where it gets remarkable, because somewhere in that same Jerusalem, in that same temple Herod spent decades expanding, an old man is still walking the courts every single day. You remember him, Simeon, still waiting, still holding on to a promise from the Spirit of God that felt, by now, almost impossible to believe. Decades of watching young couples bring their babies to the temple. Decades of wondering if this child, or this one, might be the one. Decades of growing old inside a promise that refused to expire. And then one ordinary day, the Spirit moves him, not with thunder, not with a vision, just a quiet internal certainty pulling him toward the temple courts at the exact moment a young couple from Nazareth walks in, carrying a 6-week-old infant for the ceremony required by Jewish law. You can imagine Simeon's hands, the same hands that have aged through 400 years of national waiting compressed into one lifetime, slowly reaching out. The parents, Mary and Joseph, watching this elderly stranger approach their child without fully understanding why. And Simeon takes the baby Jesus into his arms. He says, "It was finished." Not almost finished, finished. The Gospel of Luke records his words, an old man speaking to his God with the kind of relief that only comes after decades of holding on to something other people had long since stopped believing. He says, in essence, that he can depart this life in peace now, because his own eyes have finally seen the salvation God prepared for all people, a light to the nations, the glory of Israel. Think about what that moment actually contains. 400 years of silence, a scattered language stitched back together by exile, a conquering empire that accidentally spread a common tongue across the earth, a revolt that proved Israel's faith could survive persecution. Three competing religious movements, each desperately searching the same prophecies, some of them literally counting years. A brutal, occupying empire that built the very roads the gospel would travel. And a pagan emperor's tax census that placed a poor couple in exactly the town an ancient prophet had named centuries earlier. The Apostle Paul, writing decades later to a small church in Galatia, looked back on this exact moment and described it with one Greek phrase that captures everything you have just walked through. He called it the pleroma of time, the fullness of time. The Greek word means more than just the right moment. It pictures a container being filled, drop by drop, year by year, event by event, until it is filled completely, with nothing left to add and no room left for one more drop. That is what 400 years of silence actually was. Not an empty container God forgot about. A container being filled to the exact point of overflow. Every thread fitted together without a single visible miracle to announce that it was happening. No prophet stood up during those 400 years and said, "This is why the silence matters." No voice from heaven explained the plan in advance. It only made sense looking backward, the way every act of patient, hidden engineering only makes sense once the building is finished and you can finally see the whole structure standing. You have likely felt your own version of this. A season where prayers seem to disappear into silence. A waiting period with no explanation, no timeline, no comfort beyond the bare fact that you were still waiting. Maybe you are in that season right now. Maybe the silence in your own life feels less like Malachi's confident ending and more like a question mark that never gets answered. Think of the early church father Augustine, centuries after Simeon, sitting in a garden in Milan, wrestling for years with a faith he could not fully commit to, hearing what felt like nothing but silence from God while his own life fell apart around him. He too would later write about waiting on a God who seemed silent right up until the exact moment everything changed. You are not the first person to feel forgotten in a quiet season, and you will not be the last. Something about waiting on God, it seems, has always felt this way to the people doing it. Here is what Simeon's story, and the 400 years behind it, actually says to you. Silence is not the same thing as absence. A season with no visible answer is not necessarily a season with no movement. Somewhere underneath the surface of your waiting, threads may already be moving into place that you will not be able to see until you, like Simeon, are finally holding the answer in your own hands. So what do you actually do with a story like this? Let's bring it home with 3 things worth carrying out of these 400 silent years. The first takeaway is simple, but it changes how you read the whole Bible. Silence in Scripture is never empty. Every gap, every unexplained stretch of years, every place where the text seems to skip ahead is not God taking a break from his people. It is God working in a register that does not announce itself, the way a foundation gets poured long before anyone can see the building rising above it. The next time you hit one of those quiet stretches in your own reading of Scripture, you will know better than to assume nothing was happening there. The second takeaway is more personal. The exile that cost Israel its language, the empire that conquered its land, the king who defiled its temple, the occupation that taxed its people into Bethlehem, none of these were sent with a warning label saying, "This is part of the plan." They felt, to the people living through them, like loss, like grief, like abandonment. And yet, every one of them became raw material God used to prepare the exact moment the Messiah arrived. Your own hardest seasons, the ones that feel the most senseless while you are inside them, may be doing more than you can currently measure. You may not get to see the blueprint while you are living inside the construction. But here is the third takeaway, and this is the one I want you to sit with the longest. Simeon did not get an explanation. He got a promise, and he got decades of silence in between. He never received a timeline. He never received a sign that told him how much longer he had to wait. He simply kept walking into that temple, morning after morning, year after year, holding on to 7 words from the Spirit of God that could have been spoken to him in his 30s and not fulfilled until he was an old man with shaking hands. And on the one ordinary morning everything finally changed. He did not need an explanation anymore. He just needed to hold the answer in his arms. That is what the 400 years of silence were always pointing toward. Not a doctrine, not a date, on a timeline. A moment so personal, so physical that an old man could finally stop holding his breath and say it was finished. If you take nothing else from this video, take this. Your waiting is not wasted. It is not proof that you've been forgotten. It may simply mean the container is not full yet. Which part of this hit you the hardest? The lost language stitched back together through exile, the revolt that proved Israel's faith could survive persecution, the roads Rome built without knowing who would walk them, or Simeon finally holding the child he waited his whole life to see. Tell me below which one stayed with you, because I read every comment and I want to know. If you are in a silent season right now, if you have been waiting for an answer that has not come yet, I hope this gave you something to hold on to. The same God who said nothing out loud for 400 years was never actually silent. He was building. And he is still building now, even in the quiet, even when you cannot yet see what it is going to become.